Hey there, friend. Welcome back to another journey through history's darker corners. Tonight, we're stepping aboard the most famous ship that ever sailed. Not for glory, but for a collision with fate that still echoes more than a century later. Whether you're settling in for the night or just need to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you've joined me here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. What city, what country, what time it is as you press play. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all drifting through history together, scattered across time zones, but connected by these stories. If this kind of gentle historical storytelling helps you unwind, consider subscribing. We have many more tales to explore together. Now, before you get too comfortable, let me paint you a picture. It's April 10th, 1912. The sun is gleaming off the polished brass fittings of the largest, most luxurious moving object ever created by human hands. The RMS Titanic sits docked in Southampton, England, and she is magnificent. Nearly 900 feet long, 11 stories high, with a grand staircase that wouldn't look out of place in a palace. 4 massive smokestacks pierce the sky like monuments to human ambition. You might think you know this story. The unsinkable ship, the iceberg, the band playing as she went down. But here's what most people don't realize. The Titanic wasn't just a tragedy waiting to happen. She was a perfectly orchestrated disaster, a symphony of small decisions and overlooked details that turned what should have been a routine voyage into history's most infamous maritime catastrophe. And you? Well, if you'd been aboard that night, your chances of survival would have depended on factors you couldn't control, in ways you couldn't imagine. Your ticket class, your gender, your age, even which side of the ship you happened to be on when the lights went out. All of it would have mattered more than your strength, your swimming ability, or your will to live. So settle in now. Let the day's tensions fade like morning mist. Tonight, we're boarding the Titanic, not as passengers filled with hope and excitement, but with the sobering knowledge of what's waiting in the cold Atlantic waters ahead. This isn't just the story of a ship that sank. It's the story of why, on that terrible April night, survival was less about heroism and more about luck, and why, statistically speaking, you probably wouldn't have made it home. Picture this. You're standing on the dock at Southampton, gripping a third-class ticket that cost you nearly 2 months' wages. The Titanic looms above you like a floating city, her black hull gleaming with fresh paint, her white superstructure bright as bone in the morning sun. Passengers stream up the gangways, first-class travellers in silk and fur, second-class families clutching their modest luggage, and hundreds of third-class emigrants like yourself, carrying everything they own in battered suitcases and canvas bags. You don't know it yet, but you've just bought a ticket to a carefully constructed death trap. Now, I don't mean the ship was deliberately designed to sink. Quite the opposite. The Titanic was the pinnacle of Edwardian engineering, built by the prestigious Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. Her designers had incorporated every safety feature they could imagine. 16 watertight compartments that could be sealed at the flip of a switch, a double hull to protect against minor collisions, and enough lifeboats to meet and actually exceed the legal requirements of the time. But here's the thing about those legal requirements. They were based on laws written decades earlier, when ships were smaller and voyages shorter. The regulations hadn't kept pace with the massive scale of modern ocean liners. The Titanic carried lifeboats for 1,178 people. She sailed with 2,224 souls aboard. Do the math, and you'll realize that even under perfect conditions, calm seas, no panic, everyone following orders, nearly half the people on that ship were doomed from the moment they cast off from Southampton. But let's say you don't know this as you settle into your third-class cabin deep in the ship's belly. You're probably sharing that cabin with strangers, sleeping on a narrow bunk with a thin mattress and a single blanket. The walls are painted white metal, the floor is steel, and everything smells of fresh paint, coal smoke, and the faint tang of machinery oil. Your porthole, if you're lucky enough to have one, is barely large enough to frame a dinner plate. Meanwhile, 6 decks above you, the first-class passengers are settling into accommodations that rival the finest hotels in London or New York. Private suites with sitting rooms and private promenades. 4-poster beds with silk sheets. Personal servants to unpack their steamer trunks filled with evening gowns and dress shirts. They dine in a restaurant that serves 11 courses, with menus printed daily in multiple languages. This isn't just about comfort, it's about geography. And on the night of April 14th, geography would mean the difference between life and death. The first-class accommodations were located on the upper decks, close to the lifeboats, with easy access to the boat deck where the evacuation would take place. Third-class passengers were housed in the lower sections of the ship, behind locked gates and down narrow corridors that would become death traps when the lights failed and the ship began to list. But even location couldn't save you from the fundamental problem. There simply weren't enough lifeboats. And the ones that were there, they were lowered with military precision and catastrophic inefficiency. Here's something that might surprise you. The first lifeboat to be lowered, Boat 7, had a capacity of 65 people. It was launched with just 28 aboard. Boat 1, designed for 40, carried only 12. Boat after boat left the Titanic half empty while hundreds of people waited on deck, many of them believing the officers' assurances that the ship was unsinkable and the lifeboats were just a precaution. The crew, you see, had never drilled for a real emergency. They'd practiced lowering the boats, but never with passengers, never at night, never with a ship listing to one side and steam screaming from the funnels. When the moment came, panic set in. Orders were shouted and countermanded. Passengers were told to wait, then told to hurry, then told to wait again. If you were a woman or child, you had a better chance. The women and children first protocol was generally followed, though not universally. If you were a third-class passenger, you faced locked gates and overwhelmed crew members who spoke only English, while you might speak only Italian, or Swedish, or Arabic. If you were a man traveling alone, especially in steerage, your chances were slim indeed. Let's walk through what your final hours might have looked like. It's 11:40 p.m. on April 14th. You've been asleep in your third-class bunk when a shudder runs through the ship. Not violent, just a tremor that stops the engines and brings an odd, unsettling silence. You might have felt the impact if you were awake, but many passengers slept right through it. The collision with the iceberg lasted only 37 seconds. No screaming, no dramatic crash, just a grinding, scraping sound that most people dismissed as the engines shutting down. For the first hour after impact, life aboard the Titanic continued almost normally. Passengers wandered the corridors, asking stewards what had happened. The engines were stopped, but that wasn't unusual. Ships often paused to make repairs or adjust their course. Some passengers even went up on deck to see the ice that had fallen onto the forward well deck, picking up chunks as souvenirs, laughing as they tossed snowballs made from glacial ice. Below the waterline, though, the Atlantic was pouring in through a series of punctures and buckled plates along the ship's starboard side. The damage extended across 6 watertight compartments. The Titanic had been designed to survive flooding in 4 compartments, maybe 5. 6 was beyond her limits. She was already dying, though it would take nearly 3 hours for her to admit it. By midnight, the mailroom was flooded. By 12:15, water was spilling over the top of the bulkhead into Boiler Room 5. By 12:30, the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, had completed his inspection and delivered his verdict to Captain Smith. The Titanic would sink probably within an hour. Andrews was optimistic. She actually had closer to 2.5 hours left. But here's what makes the Titanic disaster so particularly cruel. Time. There was enough time to save everyone, if the evacuation had been handled properly, if there had been enough lifeboats, if the crew had been better trained, if the passengers had understood the severity of the situation. Instead, precious minutes ticked away while officers debated whether to wake the passengers, while first-class travellers leisurely gathered their valuables, while third-class passengers were told to wait below decks, because surely this couldn't be serious. The band really did play as the ship went down, starting with cheerful ragtime numbers to keep spirits up, gradually shifting to hymns as the situation became undeniable. They played Nearer My God to Thee near the end, though survivors disagreed about which version, the American or the British. It's a detail that would have mattered very little to you as you found yourself standing on a deck, tilted at an impossible angle, watching the dark Atlantic rushing up to meet you. If you were among the lucky few who made it into a lifeboat, your ordeal was far from over. The night was moonless and bitterly cold, with water temperature around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below freezing. The lifeboats had few provisions, no lights, and limited protection from the elements. You would have spent hours listening to the screams of people dying in the water, gradually fading to silence as hypothermia claimed them. Those who went into the water had perhaps 15 minutes before losing consciousness, 30 minutes before their hearts stopped. The few who were pulled from the sea alive had survived only because they'd found floating debris to cling to, keeping most of their body out of the killing cold. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, you're still in that third-class cabin, and it's approaching midnight on April 14th. You don't know it yet, but you have roughly 2 hours and 20 minutes before the Titanic's lights go out forever, and she slides beneath the surface of the Atlantic, taking 1,114 people with her. Your survival will depend on factors you can't control and decisions you haven't yet had to make. Will you trust the crew's assurances that the ship is safe, or will you push your way up to the boat deck? Will you be able to navigate the maze of corridors and staircases in the dark? Or will you become lost in the labyrinth of the ship's lower decks? Will you be among the 710 who lived to tell the tale, or among the 1,514 who didn't? The clock is ticking, and the North Atlantic is waiting. The orchestra is still playing cheerful waltzes in the first-class lounge as you make your way through the narrow corridors of E-deck. The electric lights hum overhead, casting long shadows between the white-painted bulkheads. Everything feels normal, almost boringly so. You pass other third-class passengers in the hallway, some heading back to their cabins, others lingering near the portholes, trying to catch a glimpse of what happened up on deck. You don't realize it yet, but you're already making the first of many decisions that will determine whether you see morning. Do you go back to bed, trusting that the crew knows what they're doing, or do you follow that nagging instinct that something isn't quite right? Most passengers chose sleep. After all, this was the Titanic, the unsinkable ship. The newspapers had said so. The White Star Line had said so. Even the crew seemed relaxed, joking with passengers about the ice party happening up on the forward deck. Why panic over what was probably just a minor delay? But if you were one of the few who decided to investigate, you might have noticed some troubling details. The ship's engines, which had been thrumming steadily since Southampton, had gone silent. The slight vibration that passengers had grown accustomed to, the heartbeat of the great liner, had stopped entirely. And if you pressed your ear to the hull, you might have heard something that would have chilled your blood. The sound of water, lots of it, rushing somewhere it shouldn't be. Down in the postal compartment, 5 postal clerks were already fighting a losing battle against the rising Atlantic. They worked frantically, hauling 200,000 pieces of mail to higher decks, their boots splashing through water that rose from their ankles to their knees to their waists. They would all die at their posts, and not a single piece of mail would be saved. But their struggle was hidden from you, taking place in the ship's depths where passengers weren't allowed to go. The Titanic's design, you see, was both her greatest strength and her fatal weakness. Those 16 watertight compartments that were supposed to save her could only help if the damage was contained to a few sections. But the iceberg had done something the designers never anticipated. It had scraped along the ship's side like a can opener, puncturing or damaging 6 compartments in a row. The ship could survive 4 flooded compartments, maybe 5 if they were lucky. 6 was a death sentence. As the water poured in, it followed the laws of physics with ruthless efficiency. The ship's bow began to settle deeper into the ocean, causing the deck to tilt forward at an almost imperceptible angle. You wouldn't notice it at first, maybe a marble rolling slightly on a table, or the feeling that walking toward the stern required just a bit more effort than it should. By 12:15 a.m., nearly 35 minutes after the collision, the ship's officers finally began to grasp the magnitude of the situation. Captain Edward Smith ordered the crew to begin preparing the lifeboats. Not to launch them, mind you, just to prepare them. Many passengers who wandered up to the boat deck at this time were told to go back to their cabins. The crew didn't want to cause a panic over what might still be a false alarm. This is where your class of ticket became a matter of life and death. If you were travelling first class, you were already on the upper decks, close to the lifeboats, with stewards who knew your name and cabin number. When the time came to evacuate, someone would come looking for you. If you were in second class, you had a fighting chance. Your accommodations were in the middle sections of the ship and the crew would make some effort to guide you to safety. But if you were in third class, you were on your own. The gates that separated steerage from the upper decks weren't just social barriers. They were physical ones, locked and guarded by crew members who'd been told to keep third-class passengers from wandering into areas where they didn't belong. These gates, designed to comply with American immigration laws that required different classes to be kept separate, would become death traps. Imagine trying to navigate your way through the ship's maze-like interior as she began to list more severely. The corridor floors, once level, now sloped downward toward the bow. Electric lights flickered as the ship's power plant struggled with the changing angles. The elegant oak paneling and brass fittings that had seemed so luxurious a few hours earlier now created obstacles and confusion in the dim, tilting passages. And the cold. Oh, the cold was already seeping in. The North Atlantic in April is a killing cold, the kind that penetrates steel hulls and wool coats with equal ease. As the ship settled deeper, that frigid water began to affect everything it touched. The air grew colder, your breath started to mist, and the metal bulkheads became slick with condensation. By 12:45 a.m., an hour and 5 minutes after impact, the first lifeboat was finally lowered into the water. Boat 7, on the starboard side, designed to carry 65 people. It left with 28 aboard, mostly first-class women and children, along with a handful of crew members to row. The boat was less than half full, but the officers were still hoping they could load people into boats from the lower gangway doors, a plan that would never work because those doors were already underwater. If you were still below decks at this point, trying to make sense of conflicting orders and confusing announcements, you were running out of time faster than you knew. The Titanic was settling by the bow at an increasing rate, and each minute that passed made escape more difficult. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was moving through the first-class areas with a haunted expression, checking his pocket watch and making calculations that no one wanted to hear. The water was now spilling over the top of Bulkhead E, flooding Boiler Room 5. The firemen and engineers down there fought to keep the power on, knowing that when the lights failed, panic would follow. They stayed at their posts, feeding coal into the boilers and maintaining steam pressure so the ship's electrical systems could keep running. Most of them would die there, far below the waterline, ensuring that passengers above had light to see by and wireless power to call for help. Meanwhile, in the wireless room, operator Jack Phillips was sending out distress calls with increasing desperation. CQD, 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 the old international distress signal, followed by the ship's call letters, MGY, and then, for one of the first times in maritime history, the new distress signal, SOS. The message was simple and terrifying. We are sinking fast, passengers being put into boats, but the nearest ship, the Californian, had shut down her wireless for the night. Her operator had gone to bed just minutes before the Titanic's calls began. The Carpathia, racing toward them from 58 miles away, wouldn't arrive for nearly 4 hours. Help was coming, but it would be far too late for most. As the ship's list grew more pronounced, passengers finally began to understand that this wasn't a drill. The deck chairs that had been neatly arranged for afternoon tea now slid toward the bow. Glasses and china crashed in the dining salons. The grand staircase, that masterpiece of Edwardian craftsmanship, became a treacherous slope where elegantly dressed passengers struggled to maintain their footing. By 1:15 a.m., the bow was underwater up to the ship's name. The forward well deck, where passengers had been playing with ice chunks just an hour earlier, had vanished beneath the dark Atlantic. And still, incredibly, the band played on, moving from ragtime to popular songs to hymns as the reality of the situation became undeniable. If you were lucky enough to be among the women and children being loaded into the boats at this point, you faced a terrifying prospect. Being lowered 70 feet down the side of a tilting ship into a small wooden boat in the middle of the North Atlantic at night. The davits creaked and groaned under the weight. The ropes were stiff with cold and difficult to handle. Several boats were nearly dumped into the sea when inexperienced crew members struggled with the lowering mechanism. And if you were a man, particularly a third-class passenger, your options were becoming desperately limited. The women and children first protocol was being enforced with varying degrees of strictness, depending on which officer was in charge of which boat. Some allowed men aboard when no women were present. Others fired warning shots to keep men away from the boats entirely. The Titanic was designed to be a floating palace, but she was dying like a wounded animal. Slowly, inexorably, with a kind of terrible dignity that made the disaster all the more heartbreaking. As she settled deeper into the Atlantic, her lights still blazing, her orchestra still playing, she remained beautiful even in death. Passengers who managed to get into lifeboats would later describe the awful majesty of watching the great ship's final moments, her propellers rising out of the water, her stern pointing toward the stars like a cathedral spire before she broke apart and disappeared forever. But that final moment was still more than an hour away. Right now, the ship was fighting for every minute. And so were you. The orchestra has moved to the boat deck now, their evening clothes incongruous against the chaos unfolding around them. It's 1:30 a.m., and the Titanic's bow is settling deeper with each passing minute. The forward funnel is nearly level with the water, and the ship's bridge, that command center where Captain Smith has spent 4 decades of his maritime career, is about to be swallowed by the Atlantic. If you're still aboard at this point, you're part of a dwindling population. Nearly half the lifeboats have been launched, most of them shamefully underfilled. But here's the cruel mathematics of the situation. Even if every lifeboat had been packed to capacity, even if the evacuation had been handled with perfect efficiency, there still wouldn't have been enough room for everyone. The ship's designers and the Board of Trade had calculated lifeboat capacity based on the ship serving as a rescue vessel for other ships in distress. They never imagined a scenario where the Titanic herself would be the one sinking. The deck is tilting noticeably now, perhaps 10 degrees down by the bow. Walking becomes treacherous as passengers slip and slide on the painted steel surfaces. The elegant teak decking that had seemed so solid and permanent now feels like a funhouse floor, shifting beneath your feet in ways that make your inner ear scream warnings. And the sound. God. The sound. The ship is groaning now, metal under impossible stress, rivets popping like gunshots, glass shattering as windows buckle under the strain. Deep within the ship's hull, you can hear water rushing, roaring like a waterfall as the Atlantic claims compartment after compartment. The Titanic is singing her death song, and it's a symphony of destruction that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. By now, if you haven't made it to the boat deck, your chances are becoming desperately slim. The corridors in the lower sections are flooding, not just with water but with people. panicked passengers pushing and shoving towards staircases that lead up and away from the rising sea. The electric lights flicker more frequently now as the ship's generators struggle with the increasing angle. In the darkness between the flickers, you can hear crying, shouting, prayers in a dozen different languages. The third-class passengers are finally being allowed up from the lower decks, but many of the pathways they knew are already impassable. The elegant first-class areas they'd only glimpsed during the voyage, the grand staircase, the smoking room, the palm court, have become refugee camps filled with desperate people clutching life preservers and searching for ways onto the boat deck. At 1:40 a.m., the last lifeboat on the port side is lowered away. Collapsible Boat D carries away 44 people, including several small children whose parents had thrust them into the arms of strangers, knowing they themselves would never leave the ship. The mathematics of survival have become stark and unforgiving. Women and children first, but only if they can reach the boats in time, only if there's room, only if they don't freeze to death in the lifeboats before rescue arrives. The band has stopped playing popular songs now. Wallace Hartley, the band leader, calls for "Nearer My God to Thee," and the 7 remaining musicians, they started the evening with 8, but the bassist has already tried unsuccessfully to reach a lifeboat, play the hymn with numb fingers on instruments that will soon rest on the ocean floor. If you're a man still aboard the ship at this point, you're facing a terrible choice. The lifeboats are gone, save for 2 collapsible boats that may or may not be launched successfully. You can try to stay with the ship as long as possible, hoping against hope that help will arrive in time, or you can take your chances in the killing cold of the North Atlantic. The water temperature is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees below freezing. The human body can survive in water this cold for perhaps 15 minutes before losing consciousness, 30 minutes before death. These aren't estimates. They're facts that would be grimly proven by the 1,514 people who would go into the water with the ship. Captain Smith has released the crew from their duties, though most choose to stay at their posts. The wireless operators continue sending distress signals until the power fails. The engineers remain below, maintaining steam pressure until the boilers are flooded. These men know they're going to die, but they stay because their sacrifice might save others. By 2:00 a.m., the Titanic's bow is completely underwater. The ship's angle has increased dramatically, perhaps 20 degrees now, and passengers can no longer maintain their footing on the sloping decks. The beautiful first-class promenade, where passengers had strolled in their finest clothes just hours earlier, is now a steep slide toward the dark Atlantic. The 2 remaining collapsible lifeboats present a final, desperate hope. Collapsible A is partially swamped as it floats off the deck, taking on water and passengers in equal measure. Collapsible B flips over as the ship's structure collapses around it, leaving survivors clinging to its overturned hull. These aren't rescues, they're barely controlled disasters. And then, at 2:17 a.m., the lights go out. The Titanic's electrical system, which has kept the ship illuminated throughout the disaster, finally fails as seawater reaches the generators. The sudden darkness is absolute, terrifying, filled with the screams of people who can no longer see the deck beneath their feet or the water rushing up to meet them. In that darkness, you would hear the sound that survivors would describe for decades afterward. The sound of everything not bolted down, furniture, dishes, pianos, people, crashing toward the bow as the ship's angle became impossible to maintain. The great liner's back is breaking under stresses no ship was designed to endure. At 2:18 a.m., the Titanic's hull snaps in 2 between the 3rd and 4th funnels. The stern section, suddenly relieved of the weight of the flooded bow, actually rights itself for a moment, floating almost level before beginning its own final plunge. For those still aboard, this brief respite might have seemed like salvation, until the stern section began to flood and tilt, and they realized their agony was only prolonged, not ended. The bow section, its hull torn open like a jagged wound, disappears immediately into the depths. The stern follows 3 minutes later at 2:20 a.m., sliding beneath the surface with a tremendous roar of escaping air and collapsing structure. And then, silence. The most profound silence any of the survivors would ever experience. After hours of groaning metal and shouting voices and orchestral music, the North Atlantic was suddenly completely quiet, except for the voices in the water. 1,500 people, give or take, had gone into the ocean with the ship. For the first few minutes, their cries for help created a sound that survivors in the lifeboats would describe as unlike anything they had ever heard. A kind of collective wail that rose and fell with the swells of the dark Atlantic. But hypothermia works quickly in water this cold. Within 10 minutes, most of the voices had fallen silent. Within 20 minutes, there was almost no sound at all, except the gentle lapping of small waves against the lifeboats and the quiet sobbing of survivors who understood that they were now alone on the ocean with no guarantee that help would come. The lifeboats, those that had been successfully launched, now faced their own desperate struggle for survival. They were overcrowded or underfilled, poorly supplied, and scattered across several square miles of ocean. Most had no lights, limited food and water, and inadequate protection from the cold. Several boats nearly capsized in the hours that followed, and hypothermia claimed lives even among those who had escaped the ship. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe did something remarkable. He organized several lifeboats into a flotilla and actually returned to the wreckage site to search for survivors. They found only 4 people still alive in the water, and one of those died shortly after being pulled aboard. Out of more than 1,500 people who went into the water, only 4 were rescued alive. The Carpathia arrived at 3:30 a.m., racing through ice fields in the dark to reach the disaster site. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, had pushed his ship beyond her normal limits, arriving nearly an hour ahead of schedule. But even this heroic effort was too late for all but 710 souls, the ones who had made it into the lifeboats and survived the night. If you had been aboard the Titanic that night, the statistics were not in your favor. If you were traveling third class, your survival rate was roughly 24%, less than 1 in 4. If you were a man in third class, your chances dropped to just 16%. If you were traveling first class, you had a much better chance, 62% survival rate. But even money and privilege couldn't guarantee safety when there simply weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. The Titanic disaster revealed uncomfortable truths about Edwardian society that many would have preferred to ignore. Class distinctions that seemed merely social became matters of life and death. The ship's design, which prioritized luxury over safety, became a tomb for those trapped in its lower sections. And the maritime regulations that were supposed to protect passengers had been written for a different era, when ships were smaller and disasters less catastrophic. In the end, the Titanic sank, not because of any single catastrophic failure, but because of a cascade of smaller failures, design decisions, regulatory oversights, procedural mistakes, and simple human errors that combined to create one of history's most preventable disasters. The iceberg was merely the trigger. The real causes ran much deeper, embedded in the very assumptions about progress, technology, and human infallibility that defined the age. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the 2,224 souls who boarded the Titanic on that bright April morning in 1912. They were ordinary people living in extraordinary times, full of hopes and dreams and plans for the future. They believed, as we all do, that tomorrow would come, that the journey would end safely, that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle nature might provide. They were wrong, of course. But their story reminds us that survival often depends less on individual heroism than on circumstances beyond our control. The class of our ticket, the location of our cabin, the timing of our decisions, and the simple, random luck that determines whether we find ourselves in the right place or the wrong place when disaster strikes. The North Atlantic is quiet now, nearly 400 miles south of Newfoundland, where the Titanic rests in two pieces on the ocean floor, 12,500 feet below the surface. The ship that was supposed to be unsinkable has become a monument to human fallibility, a reminder that progress and tragedy often sail together on the same tide. Sweet dreams, and may your own journeys be safer than theirs.